of our series of debates centered on California ballot propositions that are before voters this fall. If you're like me, you probably received your ballot in the mail. I got mine in the mail yesterday. So this series is part of the Colleges of Law programming to get back to the community through education, through educating our voters on the ballot propositions that are before you. The series started in 2016. We did two debates that year. We came back in 2018 to the debate on Proposition 10 on rent control. And then of course, we're back this fall with 3 debates. For those that joined us last week for Proposition 25 on cash bail, welcome back. It was a terrific program. If you're unable to join us for that program, you'll be able to see the link to the recording on our social media feed. So I'll invite you to go have a look over there. We'll be back next Thursday from 5:30 to 6:30 for the 3rd and final debate. That one's going to be on Proposition 22, and that's focusing on the gig economy. But tonight, it's Proposition 16, and we have just a terrific panel for this program this evening. I can't say enough about our debate participants tonight. I'll give brief introductions in a moment. But first, we're going to just go over housekeeping rooms in the format of our program tonight. So how it's going to work is each of our debate participants will have opening remarks of 2 to 3 minutes. As the moderator of the program, I'm going to be listening to the key points made by each debate participant. And then we'll have a moderated discussion for about 20-25 minutes. We'll have an opportunity for each debate participant to ask a question of each other, to have a little bit of a cross-examination, and then it's over to you, our audience. Now, the audience members can participate by putting questions into the Q&A feature. If you're familiar with Zoom, you'll be able to see that in your Zoom panel of tools. Just drop a question in there, and my friend Christopher Kane, the producer of tonight's program, and I will be watching those questions as they come in, and we'll be selecting those for the debate participants. We'll then finish the program with a 1 to 2 minute closing remarks, and then we'll complete the program. We're going to be done by 6:30. Now, as participants, you can participate not only by asking questions, but also by completing our poll. In just a minute, I'm going to open the poll, and that poll will just be very simple. On Proposition 16, you'll have 3 choices. Are you in support of Proposition 16? Yes, no, or are you undecided? In fact, I'm going to launch that poll right now. We're going to run the poll up until the opening remarks. I'll end it at that time. We'll run the debate, and then we're going to run the poll again. And the debate participant that sees the most movement between the first and the second poll will be declared our winners for the evening. So while we keep that poll going, it's running right now. Got a lot of undecideds I see coming in here. I am going to, you should probably have all received this in the mail. This is your book, your guidebook for the ballot propositions. This was sent to all registered California voters. I'm just going to read right from it. These are the points that are being presented to all voters. And then we're going to go to introductions and opening statements. So Proposition 16 reads as follows: allows diversity as a factor in public employment, education, and contracting decisions. It permits government decision-making policy to consider race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin to address diversity by repealing Article 1, Section 31 of the California Constitution, which was added by Proposition 209 in 1996. Proposition 209 generally prohibits state and local governments from discriminating against or granting preferential treatment to individuals or groups on the basis of race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin in the operation of public employment, education, or contracting. It does not alter other state and federal laws guaranteeing equal protection and prohibiting unlawful discrimination. As the audience tonight, I invite you to really listen to the language in the proposition, because these are the points that our participants are going to be focusing on this evening. I'm going to keep the poll going for another minute while I read quick introductions of our participants, starting with arguing yes on Proposition 16. It is my privilege to welcome Dr. Renee Fraser to our forum tonight. Dr. Fraser is the CEO of Fraser Communications and the host of The Deciders on KABC 790 AM. And arguing no on Proposition 16 is Dr. Richard Sander, who is the Jesse Dukeminier, hopefully I got that right, you can correct me, Professorship in Law at UCLA. And you're welcome to add to those introductions if you like as part of your opening remarks. I'll leave that to you. But I'm going to close the poll here in just another minute. We're going to ask for final polling. And I'm going to close the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And the poll is locked. So I will relaunch that at the end of the debate. Dr. Fraser, are you comfortable? Are you familiar with the rules? Are you ready to begin your opening statement?
I am, and thank you very much for the opportunity, Dr. Niemer, and a pleasure to be on this podium, if you will, virtually with Dr. Sander. Let me give you a very short background about why I'm passionate about this and what I intend to talk about, and why I believe so much in Proposition 16. I run a woman-owned advertising and marketing firm, and I have worked very hard on the procurement side for opportunities for my business as well as for other businesses led by people of color. I'm a big believer in creating opportunities. I myself have faced discrimination, sexual discrimination, and understand racial discrimination far better now that we are taking a long, hard look at social injustice in our country. My firm does the advertising for the state of California for First Five. We do a campaign called Talk, Read, Sing. It changes everything. All about the importance of early brain development. I'm a grandmother of 6 young children, and one of the reasons I believe in this is for their future. The fight for racial and gender equality is on the ballot in Proposition 16. It ends California's ban on affirmative action to level the playing field for women and people of color. In California, we really believe in giving everyone, regardless of race or gender, an equal shot, but we're not there yet. Prop 16 is a concrete step we can take to begin addressing the consequences of structural racism and sexism. That's why Prop 16 is supported by everyone from Vice Presidential candidate Biden, Senator Kamala Harris, Governor Newsom, the ACLU, the California Teachers Association, and many other organizations. By voting yes, we can come together as part of a movement for equality. The truth is, we're not living up to our California values. Discrimination still holds too many Californians back in hiring, employment, promotions, and educational opportunity. 3 areas I'll be talking about tonight. As a result, women in California earn less than 80 cents on every dollar compared to white men. And for women of color and single moms, it's far less. Businesses owned by people of color get only 57% of the contract dollars from the state of California that they would if everyone had an equal shot. Women receive only 29%. We all do better when everyone has a fair chance to succeed. Voting yes on Prop 16 removes barriers to equal opportunity, allowing us to live up to our California values, the values I want to see for my grandchildren. All of us will succeed if Prop 16 goes forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fraser, for your opening comments. And I'm now going to send it over to you, to Dr. Sander, 2 to 3 minutes for your opening remarks.
Well, thanks, Dr. Niemer, and thanks for having me. And thank you, Dr. Fraser, for engaging with us tonight. So I'll start by saying that I'm a liberal Democrat. I was a very early Obama supporter. I work on issues of racial inequality most of the time. I've written a book about the problem of housing segregation. So I care passionately about these issues too. But I think Prop 16 is a very misguided way to address the problems of racial and gender inequality. Essentially, what Prop 16 allows the state to do is to discriminate and grant preferences based on race and gender. It's not really about affirmative action, or at least not about most forms of affirmative action. And I think that it took a long time for us to reach a point where states gave up practices of discrimination. And we ought to think long and hard before we give that power back to state and local government. We should be particularly concerned in a state like California, where no group is in a majority, and where, at least at my University of California, the main people who would lose out, who would be discriminated against if this measure passes, are Asian Americans. Asian Americans, of course, have suffered a long history of discrimination in California, and reinstituting that in any form is deeply problematic. So the process of affirmative action, as I said, is legal. It was not affected by Prop 209, And after Prop 209 passed, the University of California launched its largest ever effort in affirmative action. They realized that they cannot use preferences to achieve the racial diversity they wanted, so they started working on the pipeline. And it was a phenomenally successful effort. They expanded the university's involvement in poor performing schools. They did a much better job of informing people about pathways to the university. And enrollment levels for Blacks and Hispanics went up after Prop 209. Blacks and Hispanics are both better represented at the university than they were before Prop 209. And just as importantly, their outcomes have dramatically improved. Before Prop 209, at my school, UCLA, the 4-year graduation rate for African Americans was 15%. That rate has tripled since Prop 209, and there are a large number of students who are getting high grades and who are sticking with difficult areas like STEM fields. So it's been a remarkable success, and we can use that type of approach to bring equality more broadly to California. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sanders. And I'm going to open with you, Dr. Sanders, and ask you offer some. We're going to start more on education. So you're saying, and one of the key points that you're making is that in the aftermath of Prop 209, we saw progress in the UC system. And can you get deeper into that, and just as a professor at UCLA, of how that went about? What were the, we'll call them workarounds or strategies, initiatives that happened that you say were a direct result? And I just want to make sure you're clear with that point. You say came out of the 1996 Proposition 209. Can you get a little bit further into that point?
Sure. Yeah. Right after Prop 209 passed, the university appointed a statewide commission to try to figure out how to deal with this. And I was on that group. And one of the things that we said is we need to start focusing on individual characteristics and not group characteristics. That means looking at socioeconomic status as opposed to skin color. And that was broadly adopted in the university. They changed the admissions process to take into account individual background. But really more importantly was what they did to the pipeline. They said, we've got to figure out how to make more students who are from low-income communities, who are predominantly Black and Hispanic, aware and enabled to make it to the university. And they launched tutoring programs. They set up, UCLA set up partnerships with several inner city schools in Los Angeles. And one of the things that did is it increased the rate at which not only applications increased, Black applications tripled over the decade after Prop 209, Hispanic applications quadrupled. But when students got accepted, they became more likely to accept the offer of enrollment. It seemed clear that they liked the idea of going to a university where at the end of the day, they were not being judged on their race. There wasn't any stigma attached to them that can result from racial preferences. They got in on the merits, just like everybody else, and their success rates were much, much higher. So is that responsive, Dr. Niemer?
It is responsive. So I'm going to take this point over to Dr. Fraser. What I'm hearing from Dr. Sanders' argument is this concept of necessity is the mother of invention. So because 209 went through in 1996, universities like UCLA or even the UC system had to find other ways outside the scope of the state or a regulatory sense to advance a diversity agenda that was successful, defined by a more diverse student population that has a pathway to success. So I invite you, Dr. Fraser, just to take that on. Do you acknowledge that we're staying with education, that the UC system has had some success here, and what would be the benefit of advancing Proposition 16?
Yes, I agree. There has been a benefit to what's happened. None of that's going to go away. I applaud the UC system for making those changes, and I'm delighted to see it. I know also that the UC's just admitted the largest Latino class ever. So you might ask, do we need it? We absolutely need affirmative action because there are systemic barriers on the way to college. A recent study found that California's Latino students, Latinx students, if you will, attend the most segregated schools in the state. They have insufficient access to influential childhood education, and they're more likely to take remedial courses at college. While 54% of California public school 12th graders are Latinos, another reason we see this increase, right? The population since 1994, 96 has gone up tremendously, 97. So 54% of the public school 12th graders are Latinos. They make up only 25% of the undergraduates in the UC system. Prop 16 reinstates affirmative action programs across the education system. And I have some specific data about the K through 12. It'll allow us to tackle the systemic discrimination and put more young people through the pipeline: African American, Asian, Pacific Islanders, and Latinos. Education experts understand that there's much more work to be done. That's why Yes on Proposition 16 campaign is endorsed by the UC Board of Regents and the Teacher Association. It's about the pipeline, and those efforts that were made to adjust the system will stay in place, which is a good thing.
So let's stay with the pipeline. Let's stay with the day after, say Proposition 16, the voters go to the polls and it advances, the yes wins. So educate us, Dr. Fraser. It sounds like you're immersed in some of the planning that's underway, some of the programs and initiatives that are underway to take advantage of a yes vote on Proposition 16. Can you just educate us more on how these, you're talking about expanding the pipeline, how would that work?
Well, the folks that are working on this, remember, I'm a marketing and communications person, so I've studied this to understand it and advocate for it. There are many people in the K through 12 arena that are working on helping to allow California schools to target resources to meet the specific needs of their students. That means focused STEM programs for girls, career training for high school students of color, and it also means educating and drawing in educators, educator outreach to reach people of color. We can invest in that when this proposition becomes law. Right now, we're not allowed to do that, right? We're not allowed to use state funds to attract teachers who are Black into the education system because we want them to be teachers. LGBT, people of color, different backgrounds. Right now, there are 250,000 students in California in school without a teacher of their same race. And 77% of the students are students of color, only 35% of the teachers are teachers of color. This would allow us to have an effort to deliberately try to make a more diverse education teacher population for our students. I'll leave it at that one example.
Well, thank you, Dr. Fraser. Let me take this point over to Dr. Sanders. So you've heard Dr. Fraser's comments. Yes, nothing would change. We'll still have the progress that we're seeing within the UC system and others, but this would further enhance that and provide a pathway for investments into communities that in a way we currently can't do because of Proposition 209. So just wanted you to take that on. What would be the reason not to just build on the progress that's already underway and advance Proposition 16?
Well, first of all, I just want to make some of the facts clear. Hispanics made up 33% of high school graduates in California before Prop 209. They make up 47% now. Dr. Fraser cited a higher figure, but she was looking at public school graduates, and you really need to look at the entire high school population. So it went from 33 to 47%. The proportion of UC California freshmen who are Hispanic went from 13% before Prop 209 to 32% in 2017. So you can see that the representation of Hispanics actually improved very substantially at UC. It's the case that these diversity programs exist on a very large scale now. I mean, my daughter is in the Los Angeles public school system, and race is clearly used as a factor in assigning students to schools. UCLA has a requirement that for every faculty hire and every faculty promotion, materials needs to be submitted on that faculty member's contribution to diversity. So these factors are already in the balance, arguably too aggressively in the balance, arguably in ways that actually violates the Constitution. But if you pass Prop 16, then the sky's the limit. And what the pre-209 experience showed, and what the experience in some other states showed, is that will lead to very explicit goals, very explicit targets, and very frequently quotas. And the problem with having an absolute bar on anyone who's not in the group, if you say, well, we're going to have these 20 teaching spots or these 30 seminar spots reserved for African Americans or reserved for women, is that you then are eliminating qualifications from, you're creating a big qualification gap between people who are inside and outside the pool. You're creating a lot of bad feelings, you're creating a lot of divisiveness. The programs that exist now overwhelmingly benefit African Americans and Hispanics, but they don't have that absolute exclusion that that means that at the border you're taking into account many other things besides race. So it makes the process much more invidious. It creates large credential gaps between people who are inside and outside the favored group, and that produces both backlash from people outside the group and what I call the mismatch problem from inside the group. And mismatch is the problem of people entering into areas, going to a college campus or taking on a job in which they don't really have commensurate qualifications, and therefore they're likely to struggle and bring discredit upon the entire process. So there's a bunch of really negative stuff that comes when you take that extra step of actually legalizing discrimination, and the benefits just don't seem at all commensurate.
Can I respond to that?
would
No quotas are not allowed. There will be no quotas. There was a Supreme Court case, not allowed. It's about consideration. Two students being considered, and and they have very similar backgrounds and very similar in terms of their scores, whatever the consideration factors are now that we know scores don't play a factor. It allows race to become a consideration, socioeconomic status. I don't expect there to be quotas. We know that that's not legal, correct?
Actually incorrect. So the Supreme Court has said that you can't have quotas, but they cited the Harvard admission system as their example of what was legal. And at Harvard, the last 3 years before a lawsuit was brought, Harvard admitted exactly the same percentage from the African American applicant pool and the non-African American pool. It was exact to the 100th of the percentage point. And they simply said, no, that's not a quota, that's simply a goal. And the district court in Boston agreed with them. So the problem is that there is no operational definition of quota that will actually be sustained by the courts. And therefore, the overwhelming pressure on administrators will be to do something that is essentially equivalent to a quota and just call it a goal.
I don't agree. And it'll be consideration. And the only other point I'd like to make is my point about the pipeline. The better educated the young people are, the more of them will go into the system. And your suggestion about mismatch is that they get into the system, they're not qualified, they can't do as well. I don't think that'll be the case. With this proposition instituted, there'll be more programs to help them exceed, and also more role models for them to move in that direction. I realize we've been on education a lot, Dr. Niemer, so I'll hand it back to you.
And we are going to move off education. We can come back to it if there's time, but I'm going to actually open the second. I'm going to go back to you, Dr. Fraser, for the second. You used some of the time in your opening remarks to talk about the workplace, to talk about contractors. I'm going to invite you to reset your takes on that, and then we'll build from that and get Dr. Sanders' response.
Right. Well, in California's dynamic economy, we have an enormous amount of money that is being spent by the state of California. I mentioned one of the contracts that I have as a company. It's First 5 California. This is a tobacco tax that was instituted in the late 90s and early 2000s. And that money goes to educate parents and to help parents of children under the age of 5. Just to be clear, most of the money goes to local commissions in all 58 counties and funds many programs in those communities based on what the community feels they need. There's a component of it that's used in media to educate. We have, the commission has taken on the topic of brain science. Brain science indicates that early child development is very critically based on talking and reading and the words that children hear. Anyway, that's a campaign that we run as a company. However, we know from our research that since Prop 209 has been in place, women and minority-owned businesses have lost $1.1 billion a year in business contracts. Contracts awarded to minority and women-owned businesses dropped 79% when affirmative action was banned, 79%. And when you look at the number of years, that's over $24 billion. Prop 16 will allow government agencies to conduct key disparity studies. They'll be able to look at where have we been unfair, where are large white men-owned businesses getting more of the contracts. And it'll also restore local government's ability to make targeted investments that empower women and minority-owned firms. That's the rationale behind the public contracting and the benefits that will occur.
Dr. Sander, your response, you can take on any of those points.
Okay, well, so let's talk about both contracting and employment. And there are a lot of government jobs in California, and African Americans are overrepresented in those jobs relative to their share of the population. So this is an area where African Americans are actually doing very well. Asian Americans are underrepresented. So there are a lot of dollars spent on employment, and that's not something where we have a diversity issue. The California in general is a very liberal state, right? And we would expect that liberal governors, administrators are going to want to try to increase diversity. They're going to try to increase opportunity. So they already have the motivation to do what Dr. Fraser would like them to do. As we saw with UC, there are many, many different ways that they could try to facilitate greater participation by minority and women-owned firms. But I would submit that if we're thinking about the issue of racial and gender inequality, this has to be about the most inefficient way of trying to attack that problem. First of all, there's the problem of surrogate firms, which occurs whenever you have these kind of diversity requirements. You get firms where women and minorities have a nominal role, but are not actually the principals behind the business. Even if you hit those firms, you are benefiting a very elite stratum of the population, people who are probably doing very well, otherwise. You're not addressing the folks who are actually in poverty. You're not addressing the folks who are actually experiencing segregation. Third, you increase government expenditures. The reason why less was spent on minority and women firms after Prop 209 passed is because it was much less expensive to bid those things competitively and to just give it to the highest quality bidder at the lowest price. A study by a UC Santa Barbara economist found that just Caltrans saved over $1 billion in bidding by moving to that type of model after Prop 209. So if we can save a lot of money by simply having merit-driven contracting, we can use those savings with our very progressive legislators to try to deal directly with the problems of racial inequality. Dr. Fraser mentioned earlier that a lot of the inequality has to do with segregation, and I really agree with that. I wrote a whole book about how lower housing segregation can really increase more equal outcomes. And we actually see that in California. San Diego and Sacramento's metropolitan areas are less segregated for Blacks than the vast majority of places in the United States. And African Americans have made dramatic progress in both those metro areas towards white levels of education and earnings and employment and even health outcomes. So if we took the money that we would otherwise be spending on, benefiting a very small group through set-aside contracts, and we invest that in things like desegregation strategies, we can have a dramatically, far, far more powerful impact upon the actual roots of racial inequality.
Can I address those, Matt?
You can, but I'm going to say just real quickly, Dr. Sanders, so Dr. Fraser, you may come back to you to reset some of the facts that you positioned, but there was, one of the points you made, Dr. Fraser, was there was substantive impact when 209 went through in 1996 with a lot of these metrics. And I'm going to, Dr. Fraser, if you can just read, you have the numbers in front of you, and then I'm going to go back to Sander, and then I'm going to come back to you on that. But the effect of 209 on these issues of contracting, can you introduce the numbers that you raised?
These are very significant. 79% of the contracts went away. I'd like to address the surrogate firms. I'm very familiar with that, having been a competitor in the government space for the last 20 years. Now there is a certification process that we go through. They actually come to your company. They ask you serious questions. They walk around. They ask employees on a random basis who runs the company. That surrogate firm baloney is not happening any longer, as far as I can tell. And I have been on the Small Business Council for the Department of General Services for 10 years. So there's a strong effort. As far as the cost to do this, what the state of California did is they instead look to give contracts to small businesses. And they have an infrastructure in place to do that. I propose if Prop 209 is dropped and this and Prop 16 comes through, what will happen is that infrastructure will be repurposed to help women and diverse companies run by people of color. So I don't see an extra expense being expended at this point. There clearly is a bias in the system, and we see it when we look at the actual contracts. It's been side-by-side comparisons, and you can see that they've gone to these larger companies who come into California, even from other states, to be able to take over those contracts when Prop 209 was put in place.
Come back to you, Dr. Sanders. So this point being made by Dr. Fraser is this presence of bias in the system, this idea that when 209 went into effect in '96, that 79% of contracts went away. There's the case was being made of a correlation there, or even a causality there. I invite you to take on those points, and then anything else you'd like to address from her remarks.
Well, I haven't seen studies that actually demonstrate that bias, and it seems a little bit incredible that in California, one of the most liberal states in the country, that we still have embedded bias in governmental decision making. I mean, at my university and at Cal State, it's so far in the other direction that it's hard for me to imagine that the government is pervaded with this issue. Why, if systemic discrimination is so pervasive in our government, do we think that those folks are going to use this power wisely? Why do we think they're not going to do invidious racial discrimination? And why is it that African Americans would be overrepresented in state and local government if there's all this invidious discrimination against Blacks and Latinos going on? It just seems to me that there's, you know, very broad generalizations that have been made, that in the areas where we've been able to carefully study it, like what's happened at the University of California, they've been clearly disproven. The kind of arguments that Dr. Fraser has made are made by regents in the university who really have no idea of what's going on in the university. They haven't looked at the facts, and I'm not saying this is true of you, Dr. Fraser, but I know that within the university, there are just these very broad claims being made about the problem of discrimination that when you actually look at the numbers are not borne out. So I think the fundamental problem is that the case hasn't been made. It has not been laid before the voters as to what are the specific things that are going to be addressed. And if we assume Dr. Fraser's right, why not limit this proposition to contracting? It's clearly not a problem in the university system. Why would we have this very broad language? Why wouldn't we have something more targeted that's on the specific problem that needs to be addressed?
And I'm going to let you have, Dr. Fraser, the final word on this. And just while you speak and address anything you'd like with Dr. Sanders' response, I'm going to put another plug out there. We're going to go to the audience very soon. So, and then Christopher, I'm going to put you on the clock as well to start monitoring the Q&A. So to the audience, if you have a question, by all means, your part of this program is up next. So would invite you to take on any of the points, or if there's something that we haven't discussed yet, to bring that into the forum. So Dr. Fraser, over to you for your response.
Yes, Dr. Sander, there is bias in the system. White men are overrepresented in leadership in city government and all the agencies. They're keeping women and people of color from climbing the ladder. Let me give you some examples. Individual cities cannot fix enormous discriminatory hiring or pay gaps on their own. With Prop 16, they'll be able to do this. Los Angeles, where women's city employees are paid 76 cents on the dollar and men outnumber women 2-to-1. There definitely is bias. We've seen evidence of it. It's unconscious bias in many cases, but there's bias in place. Prop 16 will change that, ensuring women have equal access to raises and promotions, and allows the cities to use targeted outreach programs to engage more job candidates across the board, not just African Americans, but women and of course, people of other ethnicities and races.
I'm going to allow, we're going to go to the back and forth segment now. So if Dr. Sander, if you have a question for Dr. Fraser, now would be the time. And while we do so, we'll continue to collect questions from the audience.
Well, Dr. Fraser, if let's assume that say, I don't know, 20% of the officials making contract decisions are actually biased. So Prop 16 then gives them the power to take race into account. How does that fix anything? I mean, if they're biased, then they're not going to want to take race into account in the ways that you want. Aren't they just going to perpetuate the bias? In other words, by giving these biased officials the ability to discriminate, it seems to me that you run the risk of aggravating the problem instead of fixing it.
Interesting point of view. You know, I'm a psychologist by training, and I do not see that happening in any way. I think we have good intention people, and there are influences on them that they don't even realize. When Prop 16 passes and there is consideration given and an actual data collected on the number of contracts that go to Black-owned companies, to Latina-owned companies, women-owned companies, and the data is clear that there is a bias, has been a bias in place, they can correct, and they will want to do that. I think their goal and intention is very positive. When I talked about unconscious bias. In many ways, it's built into our minds through our socialization and our cultural experience. I think many of us have seen this in this last period of time as we've been looking at racial injustice in our country. So what I'm suggesting is these are kind and good people who don't even realize the bias is taking place. The numbers will allow them to do that. And this proposition will give them the means to do deliberate outreach to those organizations to know that they're welcome. Because candidly, when you compete for a piece of business like that, you know it's a lot of work. The paperwork is like this. There's a lot of forms to fill out. You have to go through multiple presentations. You have to feel that you have an even playing field. Without Prop 16, people don't feel like they have an even playing field. These larger companies run by white men are leading and taking advantage of the situation. We need to level the playing field, and that's what Prop 16 does.
And I'm going to stay with you, Dr. Fraser. You've heard a lot of points made by Dr. Sander. Now's your time to take on any one of those. What's your question back to him?
Well, Dr. Sander, I have read some of your work, and I understand a lot of what you are trying to achieve. And I appreciate the fact that there have been some positive gains, and the University of California has deliberately worked very hard to bring in a diverse population. And as I said, I think that will continue to happen. But when I look at employment, and I mentioned the statistics about 2 men to 1, it should be 50%, should be 45%. How do we get to equity in the workplace if we don't have Prop 16? How do we get to equity in the workplace? Equity in pay and equity in employment.
Well, you know, you keep talking about equity, and this is a general refrain of people advocating Prop 16, but I don't see how allowing discrimination creates equity. I mean, there is this fundamental tension that we have whenever we talk about these racial issues, is that folks who are concerned about Prop 16 like me think that when you introduce discrimination, you're eliminating the idea of equity. You're saying we're going to apply different standards to different applicants and different groups. That is unquestionably what was pervasive at the University of California before Prop 209. We had African-American admittees at UCLA and Berkeley who had SAT scores 300 points below those of Asian American admittees. There was just a complete hierarchy. You could predict, you know, how large the gap was going to be each year before the admissions decisions were made. So I'm very concerned about that becoming the norm, and us kind of having this diversity pressure lead people to feel that they're on the defensive unless they actually achieve goal results that are indistinguishable from quotas. And that would necessarily produce differences in qualifications and resentment and racial enmity. It seems like a divisive strategy, not a way of bringing folks together. And I think that the things that you want to do, many of which I'm sure are worthwhile, can be done by saying, let's set up a state program to provide incentives to local managers who do targeted outreach, who do the kinds of things that UC did, but in a contracting context or an employment context. Let's use those good lessons and apply what worked instead of going back to a system that has discrimination.
Great questions. And Christopher, I'm going to bring you into the forum, and there is a few questions that have come in, so I'll invite you to go to the audience. We have about 12 minutes before we go to closing remarks, and then we'll do the second poll. So just both of you moderate your time accordingly. So Christopher, what do we have from the audience?
Thank you, Dr. Niemer. So our first question presumably would start with Dr. Sander. It is that it's one thing for success to work within the university. But how do you justify or incentivize the rest of the population and other businesses?
I didn't quite get that. You're saying it's one thing to do something in UC. How do you incentivize the rest of the population to do what they're doing?
That is the audience member's question. How then do we, her question specifically says justify or incentivize the rest of the population and other businesses to make the necessary change?
Yeah, well, you could certainly, you can outline the 8 strategies that the University of California used and say, we will underwrite the cost of those specific parts within the general state and local government framework where we think there is a real diversity problem, and try to get those forms of outreach, those forms of pipeline building in place. You focus on the specific problem, you focus on the process problem. You don't mandate a specific outcome. That was the key, I think, of the university's lesson and what had such spectacular results.
Dr. Fraser, your response?
Well, I'm on the opposite side. I actually feel, and I that you can't rely on people to do it, and I don't want to assume there's going to be some great infrastructure. There's no reason to see change. The University of California system changed as a result of not having the ability to look at race. So they found other ways. There's no reason for people across the state to change their behavior in employment or in procurement. There's no instigation. So I don't expect the changes to occur in any way. And frankly, in the environment that we're in with COVID-19 and the restrained resources on the state, I don't see people being able to say all of a sudden, why don't we use the 8 stages that the university system used and try to change the discrimination that exists in our system? Not likely to happen. I like the idea of the proposition because it gives people the freedom to do it the way they feel is best for their community and their city government, their state government, their procurement, and their employment practices. Because it's not one size fits all. It gives people to do it the way the ability to do it in the way they feel is best for their community.
Christopher, just speak up. Your audio is a little light, so if I need to read it, I can, but go ahead, over to you.
Very well. All right. So the next question, again, we will start with Dr. Sander. Audience question. Do you believe that our educational system suffers from the effects of institutional racism? And if so, why then not empower the institutions to pursue diversity and counteract those specific effects?
Well, the idea of institutional racism is one that's in a lot of flux. I mean, institutional racism used to mean things like systems that deliberately segregated schools or systems that excluded Asian Americans from attending a public school. Those things existed in California, and I think that, I think California was a leader in purging itself of a lot of that. It was one of the first states to pass fair housing and employment laws back in the late 1950s, almost a decade before the federal government adopted those policies. California has been a pretty progressive state, and it has lower housing segregation levels overall than any other state in the country. It has, well, except for Hawaii, it has smaller racial gaps in many areas. So I think California actually has, compared to a not very good national average, I think it's above the average. So institutional racism is sometimes now used to just describe anything where the outcomes are different. In other words, if, for example, in the California bar exam, African Americans pass at a lower rate than whites do. So the argument is made, well, then the bar has institutional racism. But that's not true. It's actually a lot more complicated than that. African Americans have trouble on the bar because many schools can legally discriminate based on race. They use very large preferences to admit students who academically struggle, who get demonstrably lower grades, and those students, regardless of race, then struggle on the bar and fail at very large numbers. So that's an example where you have what looks like a racist outcome that's being caused by an effort to try to address racism. So it's very easy for good intentions to lead folks astray. And we need to think about what are the fundamental dynamics of racial inequality in our society. And as I mentioned before, I think a key one that's been identified is levels of housing segregation. And lowering those levels directly translates into better health access for minorities. It translates into lower segregation in the schools. It translates into better access to jobs because people are often physically closer to jobs. So looking at something like housing segregation is to look at actual root causes. You're not looking at an outcome and saying, well, we're going to legislate a different outcome regardless of what's in the pipeline. You're looking at how you fix the underlying problem. So I really think that our discussion on race that we're having in America now needs to be more focused on trying to understand the root causes and address those, as opposed to mandating that outcomes be legislatively equalized.
Dr. Fraser, there's a lot to work with there. I'm going to let you have some time on this one. Dr. Sanders' response is really some of the core to this debate and this argument. I'll invite you to take on whatever you'd like.
First of all, I'd like to reframe it. I don't think it's institutional racism. I think it's systemic racism. I think racism is built into the system, and I agree with you. We need to go upstream to understand that. That's why I talked about the K through 12 pipeline, right? And that racism is built. You can't be it if you can't see it. If a young child that's 8, 9, 10, 11, determining what they want to be, and they've never seen another Black teacher or a Black dentist or a Black educator of any sort or a principal, they won't realize that's an opportunity for them. And systemic racism has created an environment where children are kept down. So we do need to make change happen. This proposition will allow a real focusing on those efforts. People's hands have been tied. I talked about specific STEM programs for girls, for Latinx students. We need to have efforts where people know there's racism in the system, that it's systemic and they can attack it early. They want to come in with interventions. A lot of it has been, as you well know, research. There are only 9 states like California that do not have affirmative action. So we have plenty of role models and interventions that help systemic racism at its core and going to the cause. And the last point I'd like to address is you're mentioning California being very progressive, that we're just above average. That's not good enough for me. This is California. We should be far above average. And Prop 16 makes a statement that we are.
Thank you. And I'm going to stay with you, Dr. Fraser. I'm going to bring in a question, if I could take this one, Christopher, from one of the participants. He dropped it actually in the chat field. So I'm going to read the question. I may give it a little bit of a spin, but I'll start with you, Dr. Fraser. The question is, why can't we resolve the issue with simple equal pay for equal work and leave the Affirmative Action Amendment as it is? My spin on that is, if, for instance, Proposition 16 was not to pass, are there other policy solutions that can be considered here to achieve some of the goals that you've identified?
Interesting and a good question. Equal pay for equal work has been in existence in some locations, it's just not applied. I will say there's also discussion around the ERA amendment at the national level. There was a need for one additional state. There was a time limit on the amendment. There's a debate now about extending or removing that time limit. If the ERA, equal rights for women, believe it or not, women don't have equal rights based on the Constitution, that comes into play. That would be helpful in terms of equal pay for equal work. But sadly, it has not been addressed at the local level. And we need this proposition so that they can be addressed. One of the parts of this institution of this proposition will be legal cases and legal battles. And as much as I think most of us don't like the legal battles, it often is the way to get policy changes in place and to make sure there's a clear examination of data. So examining the pay, the inequities, the fact that I can tell you that in LA City, women don't make as much as the man doing the same work, that can't be. But they have policies in place and have not been able to affect them. It may take a lawyer taking in a class action suit to make the adjustments take place. They can do that under the auspices of Prop 16.
Dr. Sander, your response?
I don't think Prop 16 does anything to deal with that problem. We have very good civil rights laws on the books. We have equal pay statutes, we have fair employment statutes, and those are heavily used. A large proportion of the litigation in our courts has to do with discrimination allegations. I haven't seen any evidence presented by the Prop 16 proponents that those laws don't work in the way that they're intended to. All the Prop 16 does is it says, even if there's not discrimination going on, we can now mandate that X percent is going to go for this group and X percent is going to go for that group, or something very close to that. And that's wrong. That's getting rid of equal treatment. That is institutionalizing discrimination. That is institutionalizing racism. You know, and the Harvard case illustrates this so well. Harvard wanted to have this policy of creating more, expanding the number of Hispanics and Blacks in its student body. The problem it faced was that there were so many Asian Americans who were applying who had very strong credentials. It felt that under federal civil rights law, it could only sort of push the envelope so much. So they instituted this personal rating where they started evaluating every applicant based on personality characteristics. And that produced very low evaluations for Asian Americans. That weren't because Asian Americans actually had different personality characteristics on average. It's because the university wanted to admit fewer of them. So it gave them negative personal ratings. You know, when you read the transcript from that case, it's so painfully obvious that this idea of achieving racial balance led them to really invidious forms of racism and discrimination. We want to go with the civil rights laws that we have, which are working, that have worked in California and have worked elsewhere. We don't need to set up quasi-quotas.
Thank you, Dr. Sander. I think we have time for one more question. And if we get through it fast, maybe we'll get another one in. And then we're going to do closing remarks. So those are coming next, and then I'm going to re-poll the audience. So for the audience, please stay to the end because you'll be able to see the movement from the first poll to the second poll. But I like this next question, and it is about this concept of a timeline. I'm going to go to Dr. Fraser on this. Should there be a term limit on affirmative action? Should it just exist in perpetuity? Your thoughts on that?
Interesting question. It would be very difficult to put a term limit on. One of the things I have learned after running a business for 22 years and being mission driven about healthy behaviors, environmental issues, et cetera, is it takes a long time for change. We all think it's going to happen and it takes much longer than you expect. So I think a term limit would be difficult. You know, there are only 9 states that don't have affirmative action, 41 states that do, and it's been very successful for them. So I would argue that no, we don't need a term limit. What I think will happen is once it's instituted, you'll see change occur. We do, and we know that these businesses that will be brought in, for instance, for government contracting, they'll get stronger and better and stronger and better and bigger. And there's a combining of firms that occurs. So you'll see a strengthening of the business platform. You'll see a strengthening of the pipeline of educators being people of color and young people getting the programs in K through 12. So I would hope to see 25 years from now, less of a need for it, but I'd like it still to be in place.
So in 1978, the Supreme Court decided its first affirmative action case. And it, you know, as we discussed, it allowed some forms of preferences to be used. The parties advocating for preferences in that case said, we think that we won't need these for more than 10 years, but this is a crucial bridge period. Well, that didn't pan out. Then in 2003, in the Grutter case, that was the Supreme Court's next major venture into preferences in higher education. Justice O'Connor had this famous line that she didn't expect them to be used in 25 years. In other words, by 2028, the problem would go away. So why have these predictions fail? Well, I think the key reason why they have failed, well, first of all, it's important to note that they fail. And the problems that we have of academic disparities, for example, across racial lines, are almost as severe now as they were 30 years ago. The places where they've actually declined are places that have done something about housing segregation, not to harp on that particular point. But I think a key reason why these timelines have not worked in the general area of preferences in the other 41 states that use racial preferences is because of the mismatch problem. You have these schools that use these very aggressive preferences, and it produces minority law graduates who fail the bar at very high rates. It produces a huge dropout rate of minorities from STEM fields, from science and engineering fields, and it just perpetuates the problem. It doesn't fix the pipeline at all because it's a Band-Aid being applied at the college level so that they feel good about their diversity. But if you don't deal with the underlying problem, then the preferences have to continue forever. It becomes just sort of this political salve to try to keep racial peace on campus, but it doesn't deal with the fundamental problem. Prop 16, I think, is exactly that type of Band-Aid, and that's why I don't favor it.
Thank you, Dr. Sander. And I think we're going to make it. We're going to have time for the closing remarks. So assuming we'll stay to the 1 to 2 minute, we'll run that for about 4 minutes, and then we'll have a minute or two to do the second poll. And with that, it's over to you, Dr. Fraser. 1 to 2 minute closing remarks.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you again for the opportunity. And Dr. Sander, it's been a pleasure talking with you about this. Thank you. Having a law professor on the other side makes things a little more complicated, but I appreciate your perspective. I still very strongly believe in Prop 16. I want to personally appeal to people. I think we're all at a time now where we see racism in our culture and in our country in ways we haven't seen it before. And as a Caucasian woman, I have to say it's come to my attention of ways I hadn't even realized I was a passive participant. And I don't want to be a passive participant any longer. It's hard to know where to start when you tackle racism and systemic racism and sexism. But Prop 16 is a concrete step we can take to begin removing barriers to equal opportunity for all. And that means enhancing and strengthening the pipeline for young children. So when they get to the UC system, they thrive. And that's children of all colors. In states that allow affirmative action, women and people of color earn higher wages and are able to compete on equal footing for state contracts, which I know is critical. We talked about that. 79% cut in those when Prop 209 went into place. But right now, California is one of just 9 states to ban affirmative action. And let me remind you, if you're a business owner out there, it's over $1 billion that could have gone to women and minority-owned companies during that period. Voting yes on Prop 16 is our chance. It's our chance to change all of these things and to fight systemic racism. Prop 16 gives us the tools to fight racial and gender discrimination without quotas so that we can all thrive. We as Californians need to live our values, and we need to make the future brighter for all of our children. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fraser. Dr. Sander, closing remarks, 1 to 2 minutes.
Okay. Well, thank you. I've enjoyed this too. And Dr. Fraser, I think you may well be making good points about contracting. You've certainly whetted my interest in trying to learn more about it. But I do know higher education. I do know how harmful legalized discrimination has been. Prop 16 is not about affirmative action. Affirmative action is legal in California today. It is about giving government officials the ability to use race and gender as factors in making decisions, i.e. to discriminate and give preferences based on race and gender. That's deeply problematic in itself. It's especially problematic in a state that doesn't have any racial minority, racial majority. It only has racial minorities, and a very likely victim of the discrimination at least in the university systems would be Asian Americans, who I'm really deeply troubled by the idea of us making it legal to discriminate against. We've seen through the university that there are ways to fix problems of access that are much, much more productive, much more geared at the real problems than just sort of putting these Band-Aids on the end result. I don't think we should give government authorities the ability to use discrimination. We should give them tools and give them mandates to try to rectify underlying problems. The polls currently indicate that Prop 16 is likely to lose. And if that happens, I really hope that it will lead to a discussion in California about, well, we've got to dig deeper. We've got to figure out better strategies for dealing with racial inequality. This is telling us that even in a very liberal state that is generally for trying to solve these problems, Prop 16 was not seen as the right solution. So let's search for the right solutions and let's actually get some legislative momentum between trying to implement them. that's my hope of what will happen.
And thank you, Dr. Sanders. And we have a minute left, so let's get to it. I'm pushing relaunch of the poll now, and the poll is back open, and we're going to give all about a minute to re-engage with the poll. And while we wait for the results to come in, I just want to thank our participants again, Dr. Fraser, Dr. Sanders. Thank you so much for being with us this evening for our debate program and being so prepared for the conversation. I got a response from one of the audience members that I just want to read it because it's fun. It was a much better debate than the Trump-Biden debate earlier this year.
Talking about setting a low bar.
That was a low, low bar, exactly.
Low bar, but we'll
Thank goodness.
Polls are still coming in. I want to thank the production team for our program tonight. Christopher Kane, who's with us. Carmen Bowman is with us as well. We have the IT support staff with us. I want to thank the Colleges of Law team. Dean Jackie Gardina is with us tonight watching, and members of the academic leadership team are with us, and all of the participants and audience members who've joined us tonight and taking time out of your very, very busy schedules to be a part of this conversation. So we just hit the minute mark. I'm going to count it down: 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and the poll is locked. So I'm almost there to share the results. But before we do that, let's first take a look at the pre-poll, and I'll bring that up on the screen now. So when we started this conversation, we had, as you can see here on the screen, 21% were in support of Proposition 16, 7% no, and a very large undecided constituent, 72%. More people joined the conversation after we did that poll. And so let's see where we stand. Now I'm just going to share results. Hopefully it'll come up on the screen. And you should be seeing the results. 60% moved to the yes column, 27%. We got a lot of those undecideds to move from undecided to yes and no. And it looks like the yes won. Dr. Fraser, you have taken the win tonight in our Proposition 16 debate. And so I want to congratulate and acknowledge you. With that, we're a couple minutes over. We're going to sign off. Like I said, we'll be back next Thursday, Proposition 22 on the gig economy. Hope you can see you all for that. Until then, thank you and good night.
Good night, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.